Rain had a way of making the Stormlands honest. It beat the dyes out of banners and washed the guilt from men's pretenses, leaving only sodden cloth and bare resolve. It fell in long, slant lines the night the plump Septon came ashore at the weeping town, and the lanterns along the quay were halos in the mist, and all the world beyond them was wind and salt and the black shape of the bay's teeth. He wore a patched cloak of dun wool and carried a satchel that clinked softly, and his feet knew how to find the hollows between cobbles where the water ran quick and whispered. He paused beneath the bowed ribs of an oak whose leaves shivered like coins. A cart creaked by, its wheels complaining. The driver had wrapped his face in a rag, and only his eyes showed, bloodshot and resentful. A dog nosed a heap of fish offal and then recoiled, sneezing. The air smelt of pitch and kelp and bad ale. Somewhere a bell tolled slow, slow, slow. "Septon," croaked a voice from under the oak. "For your poor brothers of the town." The plump man bent like a hinge. The coin passed unseen, as if the beggar's palm were a gap in the rain. "Watch the keys," the Septon murmured, all meekness. "Ships in the storm are like sinners on a steep stair. Most will fall. Tell me who climbs again." The beggar scratched his beard with forefinger and thumb as if twirling the words into it. "I," he said, and the Septon moved on. The tavern called the Lantern's Wife had shutters latched and a door swollen with wet. Inside, a hearth spat, and the heat was a rude hand to the face. Sailors clustered like flotsam near the fire. Behind the board leaned a woman with arms as white as bread, and a boy with a pitcher, too thin for the task. The Septon lowered his hood and smiled a benediction that was only teeth. "Small beer and a bite," he told the boy. He ate onion pasties and salt cod hacked into square inches and swillied down with beer that tasted like a plank, and he listened. He listened as he always had, detached, content, an ear with a man attached to it. Men's talk was a drift of weed. It caught on pilings and piled into heaps. Most of it was worthless, and yet among it came a gleam, a name, a slip, a rumor from a man who swore he did not gossip, a truth loosed from its lashing by ale. Mace Tyrell's men back from the march. All that bother with Storm's End and nothing to show but blisters. They say the Red Woman's shadow took Penrose. I swear it on the Seven. Don't look at me like that. Bah, all shadows do is make men piss themselves. Stannis is skulked off north to play at ice and vows. That's what I heard from a cell sail out of Gulltown. North, south, it's all the same. Free men bleed for kings and get paid in honors we cannot spend. King's Landing went quiet since the imp fled. Quiet like the hour after a squall, when the next one's gathering. The Septon smiled and folded his pasty with the dainty fingers of a man accustomed to silk. Quiet, yes. Quiet was the time for needles and thread. After he paid, he asked directions in a sympathetic tone that made men want to be helpful for no reason they could name. A lane climbed away behind the tavern, hemmed in by wattle fences grown slick as eels. At the top of the hill, a cottage brooded under a sodden thatch. He tapped at the door with the back of his knuckles, making no more noise than a moth against a page. The girl who opened had rain-tangled hair and quick eyes, and she did not smile. "You are late." "I am often late," the Septon said gently. "It makes men underestimate my speed when I come at last. You should not have come at all." "He is here," said a low voice from within, and the girl stood aside. The room smelled of damp wool and rosemary grimly trying its best against the damp. A man sat by a table pitted with knife marks. He wore a plain jerkin, but his posture gave him away. He had the look of a soldier who remembers his body even when he dresses it like a peasant's. His hair, once bright, had gone to iron at the temples, and his eyes were the color of old bruises. "Griff," said the Septon. The man inclined his head the smallest degree. "You might have come as the mummer you are, and spared us the sermon dress. This robe opens doors. Your sigil would close them." "My sigil is burnt," said the man, "but my arms are sound. See, he is in the next room." The Septon sat and set his satchel on the table. With 2 fingers he tugged loose the drawstrings and brought forth a small tin lamp, a twist of candled tallow, a flask of oil, a roll of parchment bound with red thread. He laid his hands upon them, palms smoothing the table's scars. The girl moved about the hearth, pretending she was not listening. "Is he well?" the Septon asked softly. "As well as a boy can be in this rotten air," said Griff promptly. "He chafes. He wants sea and riders and banners. He wants the wind to sing of him. He has been raised on tales." "Tales are a sort of whetstone," the Septon said. "They can sharpen a blade or shatter it. It depends on the hand. And yours is so expert." "I have had much practice," the plump man said, and for a heartbeat the truth of him peered out. "Bring him." The door to the inner room opened. A boy stepped through, and the wet night seemed to draw in, attentive as any court. He was tall for his years, not so much in height as in carriage. His hair was dark now, but there were glints in it like the soft shine on a raven's wing when the sun deigns to visit. An oddity, nothing more, unless one looked too long. His mouth was firm and better for not knowing it. His hands were hard with sword hilt and oar, but the nails were kept trim. He wore a sailor's shirt and boots with patches that had never been needed. "Septon," he said. "My prince?" the Septon replied, and he did not look at the girl to see her flinch. The boy's eyes were the color of deep water. "I thought you would be older. I thought you would be impatient," said the Septon. "We are neither what we expected." A ghost of a smile and then nothing. The boy stepped nearer the table and looked at the lamp, the thread, the parchment. He did not reach for any of them. He was learning. "Will you show me my face?" he asked. "I can only show you mirrors," the Septon said. "You will have to find your face in them. But this much I may say, the sea does no man favors. Crooked men swear by straight compasses when the wind has its way with them. It is well that we do not ask the sea's leave." "You meant to take me to Dorne," the boy said. "I meant to unveil you where you would be most wanted," the Septon said. "But want can curdle to fear. A hot land breeds slow counsels, and there are other sands that shift." The boy looked to Griff. Griff's expression did not change, but the set of his shoulders was a shield turned a little a fraction. "Why here?" said the boy. "Because storms make people yearn for harbor," said the Septon. "Because hunger is loud in a man's belly and the king in King's Landing feeds ballads to his subjects. Because Storm's End has a memory long enough to lend its strength to the right story, if it hears the word. Because men are tired, and tired men will follow the first voice that tells them they were brave to wait. And the voice is mine. If it is anyone's, it must be yours." The girl, the one with the quick eyes, set down a trencher of stew and bread, and the fumes of onion and beef and pepper filled the small room as if to crowd out the talk. The boy ate. The Septon watched him eat, approving of the slowness. He praised the food without effusion. He asked the girl her name and did not blink when she gave none. He moved like a lad who had been made to practice moving. "When?" he asked at last. "When the sea lets your friends through the teeth," the Septon said. "The Golden Company rides the whims of a god that neither you nor I can flatter. But they come. They come because their word is as good as what they call themselves, and because they have sworn it for years past counting. They will run at the shore like dogs at a door. Storm's End will hear them." Griff laced his fingers together. "And we will take it." The Septon smiled, and the smile had mischief in it. "We will open it." He laid his palms on the parchment and, with a thumbnail, broke the thread's tiny knot. Letters bloomed in the lamplight as the oil opened, lines upon lines in 3 hands and 2 ink colors, overlaid like ivy creeping across a wall. The boy bent over them, then looked up to the Septon with a slight hitch to his breath. These are the seals of men who would not thank you to speak their names before they do," the Septon said softly. "Storm lords who remember a certain dynasty's summers and a certain iron chair's bite. Gentlemen who wake sweating because their sons went to war for wolves or stags and their bones are nowhere to be found. Castellans whose larders are low. Hedge knights who have sold both horse and point of honor and hope to buy both back at a discount. Outlaws who will be pardoned for crimes they can no longer afford to commit. The boy's eyes moved left to right to left again, drinking. And if they betray? Then you will have learned a valuable lesson while taking a castle. The girl laughed once, under her breath, before she swallowed the sound. The boy frowned at her and then pretended he had not. He was learning, but not quickly enough that rain and ale and onion stew could not trip him for a heartbeat. I will go down to the quay at dawn, the Septon said. The tide will bring me something you can wear when the time comes. Old cloth with a new shape. Cloth doesn't matter, said the boy, too swiftly and then slower. But it matters to them. It always has, the Septon murmured. Did you know that a king once lost Storm's End for want of cabbage? Another kept it for want of onions. I know of Davos Seaworth, the boy said, with the pride of a pupil who has snatched up a teacher's trick before it is tossed. He ran a ship through a siege and fed a garrison with onion and salt fish. Stannis raised him for it. That's in the songs. And not in the songs are the boys who died of flux because someone brought barley too quick into bellies empty too long, Griff said. The walls are not all you must hold. Remember that. The boy nodded. He was listening to two voices at once now, one like silk over steel, and one like a glove full of armor. Outside, the rain scudded along the roof and the wind worried the thatch as a dog with a rag. When the Septon rose, the room had grown close with breath. He touched the boy's shoulder, a weight as brief as a moth, a benediction without benediction to it. Sleep, dream no banners. He went into the rain again as if it were merely a second room in the house. He pulled up his hood and walked across the hills back, down into the stink of the quay. He saw the beggar he had tipped, now sheltering under a half-wrecked boat rib, and beside him a boy with a hollow belly and bright eyes, and beside that boy a little girl with scars on her wrists like bracelets. The Septon's gaze rested upon them as one might look at a line of notes in a book, something to be remembered, to be hummed later. He slept on a pallet of moldy straw in a loft that overlooked the lantern's smear on wet planks. He dreamt of corridors that had never been built, and of doors that he opened by not touching them, and of a chair which was only a chair until someone sat upon it, and then it was a mountain, a gallows, an altar, a knife. In the morning the rain was thinner, the light sullen and reluctant. Along the horizon, teeth of foam bit at the sea. Far out, a line of dim sails was moving like ghosts marching. The Septon glanced once and then purchased a loaf from a woman whose face was a map of disappointments. He broke the loaf into 4 and carried one piece along the quay, the second wrapped in cloth, the third under his arm, the fourth in his hand. He left the first on a step that led down to black water, the second on the beggar's knees, the third he gave to the boy with the bright eyes, and the fourth he ate as he worked his way toward the customs shed. You again, said the petty captain of customs with a dryness that matched the bread. Alas, said the Septon, my humors cling to me. You priests have humors? I thought you had only potions. We are all vessels, said the Septon, and poured oil from his flask. The man's eyes followed it, because men's eyes always followed oil when it glistened. It pooled in a little thumb bowl, and the Septon floated a shred of wick upon it and touched flame to it and murmured a verse. By the light of this sanctuary, my son, the truth shall shine between us. What do you want? Asked the petty captain, hunching hunch-shouldered. To relieve you of suspicion, the Septon said, and wrote 3 names in a book that was not the captain's. By the time the first of the far sails slipped into shape enough to identify, the Septon had an inventory of the day's arrivals on a piece of parchment that had worn 6 titles in 6 ports. He folded it and tucked it into his sleeve as though tucking a child into bed. The ships were black-bellied and salt-crusted and mean-looking as knives ground too thin. They came on awkwardly because the bay's mouth never welcomed, and the men at their tillers knew they were threading needles with gusts tugging at their elbows. This, thought the Septon with a private flicker of pleasure, is the right hand for the wrong job. The Golden Company were sellswords, not sailors, but they had hired men who thought ropes and wind for a living and had paid those men enough to swear for their mothers by new saints. A gull screamed like a woman in a tale. A man at the bow of the leading carrack raised a hand. It dripped rain and something else ran down his wrist. a crude tattoo of a coiled snake. The ship shaved past a submerged boulder with inches to spare and slid like a hungry thing toward the quay. The Septon arranged to be among the first faces the captain saw. He had no badge to admit him to that honor. He had something better, an aura of inevitability. He looked as if he had always been there. The captain of the Carrack had eyes that were angry all by themselves, set too close together as if they mistrusted what they saw. He spoke a lysine-flavored common tongue and spat between sentences. "Offload fast," he barked. "The gods are stretching their shoulders for another blow." "The gods are often tired by afternoon," said the Septon, so mild he could have been soft. "May I convey your master to his meeting?" "Which master?" "The one who thinks he's hidden." The captain's eyes flicked toward a figure who had hung back on the afterdeck, under an awning woven of 3 torn sails. He wore a cloak the color of a bruise. He had the build of a man who wished to be mistaken for a clerk. Thin shoulders, long hands, until he began to move, and the lie fell away. His nose had been broken and had mended poorly, as if it resented the obedience. He descended the ladder slow as a prayer. "Homeless Harry," said the Septon, and the other man's mouth twisted. "That name follows me like a mutt, though I suppose even a mutt looks well if it guards a strong door." "Your men will look better on land," the Septon said, "and best of all behind a gate. There is a cottage upon a hill, with rosemary that does not succeed. It can hold you for a night. Hold me or hide me? Do you wish to be seen? By some very much, by others not at all. Then hide," the Septon said, and there was nothing of softness in him when he said it. They hid. They did it like men who had been paid their whole lives to step into a shadow and draw it after them. By noon the quays were a confusion of bales and barrels and men in drab cloaks who could have been fishermen, teamsters, mercers, thieves, saints. The beggar under the broken rib of boat moved twice and then did not move again. The boy with the bright eyes came and went and came and went, and every time he went, the Septon felt the cape of the world stir around his shoulders. Griff and the boy were waiting when homeless Harry Strickland and 3 of his captains came up the hill. They took the measure of each other with a series of small expressions that men not trained to notice might have missed. The tightening of a jaw as if to set a buckle, the drop of a shoulder as if a sword were being shifted to a new balance, a brief glance at the girl as if to determine whether she mattered. The girl returned the glance levelly. She mattered. "The wind wants to break masts," Strickland said without preamble by way of greeting. "We will lose 2 ships this night if we stay out there." "You will not," said the Septon. "You will because you will not. It is a very simple word. You appoint yourself admiral along with all the other titles you carry in that robe?" "I appoint myself wet," the Septon replied, and some of the hardness in Strickland's stare turned into reluctance to smile. "There is a cove 2 miles north of here, under a cliff shaped like a kneeling man. The water under him is bad and the rocks remember every ship that touched them. But there is a throat through the teeth. Old men here rode it for smuggler's gold when they were young. I am older than them. You have boats. You are telling me to hide 1/3 of my strength under a rock," Strickland said. "I am telling you that a man who can leave his caution in one pocket of his coat and his courage in the other will always have hands free. You need both before dusk." Griff shifted. "What before dusk?" "Gray cloaks," said the Septon. "Gray cloaks, cold hands, hungry eyes. Storm's End isn't held by any lord with a name worth repeating. It's held by a castellan who thinks of his job as a collection of locks. There's a man at his side who stokes his fear and another who stokes his hunger, and they pull him between them like a child's tug rope. They will expect a sortie today to rest their boredom on. Give them one." He turned to the boy. "Not you." "Why not me?" "Because a prince learns the patience that kills the impatience of the men he will rule. At least on first lessons." The boy's face flushed and went white again. Strickland watched him as men who have hired and fired watch potential. Griff did not move at all, because the art of moving without visible motion had cost him 30 years of his life. The girl reached to adjust the pot's lid. Her eyes glittered, the merest fraction. She was tireless. The Septon made a note of her the way a scribe makes a note of a page that will be needed later. When they were done with their first plans, the Septon went out into the rain again. He walked with a slight lift to his gait, not so much as to seem jaunty, but enough to give the impression of a man who had learned to sway in crowded markets. He had a habit of stop-start motion that made men think they could catch him, and then made them realize that they were walking too quickly to look as if they weren't chasing him. He spent coins without counting them and salt without a thought for the price. By dusk, the sea had gone to pewter and the clouds were iron lids pressing down. The storm came on with a pragmatist's efficiency. The first spear of rain was thrown. The second, the world was a drumming and a hiss. Ships in the cove knelt and lifted as if they were living things tethered at the knee. Men ran with ropes. Men swore at ropes. Ropes burned their palms and skinned their fingers. They were very glad to be swearing and being skinned in a hidden place rather than in the teeth of shipbreaker. Bay. On the road that ran toward Storm's End like a string drawn tight were 100 men in gray cloaks. Their cloaks were gray for practical reasons. Rain and mud had reasons for all colors, but the sameness gave them a monkish look. They moved without drums, without banners, without the arrogance of bright metal. They carried hooks and lines and bundles wrapped in oiled linen, and under the bundles lay bows taken apart and oiled, heads rag-wrapped so they would not click. The girl walked among them as if she had always known this. She had a quiver made of tanned eel skin and a small knife with a hilt wrapped in blue thread. She listened to the road and then told the road what to say: quiet, quiet, quiet. When a farm dog barked, she was there before her name could be breathed, a hand to its muzzle, her other hand opening a little bag of fat. The dog's growl turned to interest and then to greed. She did not pet it. She left it full and puzzled at its good fortune. They came to the outworks of Storm's End as the light failed and became merely a habit men persisted in. The castle rose oafish and immovable out of the rain. It was a thing built on a dare to the gods. Its walls were not walls. They were a law. The men in gray cloaks stopped without having to be told. No one looked long at the heights. Long looks made men small. The Septon joined them from a byre where he had been praying in a language he did not believe in. He shook raindrops off his sleeve like a cat shakes dust from a paw. He appeared to be humming. The girl moved nearer to him without seeming either to hide behind him or protect him, a delicate balance for a slight body to hold. Her eyes went up and down the cliff face and lingered on nothing. "Do you smell it?" the Septon asked. "Salt and wet and man. And pitch." "Pitch," he agreed softly. "There is a cask of it too near a wick in the lower guard tower." A Sloven's thing to do, but the man who placed it thought he was being clever. Keep the rope oiled, keep the wheel spinning. He will be pleased with himself until the moment he is dead. The girl's mouth twitched at a corner. "How do you know he will be dead?" "Because you will kill him." "I have never killed a man inside a stone belly," she said. "It is the same as outside," said the Septon. "Men say different things when they die within walls. They pray in a different key, but they die after the third or fourth thing they say, the same as always." The men in gray cloaks had been listening with ears that pretended to be closed. Now one of them, a short fellow with arms like an ox, nodded. "It's all the same after the third thing," he said as if soothed. "Mark your rope," the Septon said. "Not for your feet but for your hands. The sea gate staircase has a bad rung, and if you shift your weight there you will tumble and make a sound like salvation for the men above you. Keep your weight in your belly for 3 steps. Then pull like you'd pull your child back from a well." "You talk like you've climbed it," another muttered. "I talk like I've fallen," the Septon said, and he watched the way they received that truth. It was always important to place a single scar upon oneself in men's sight. The sea gate lay where it had always lain, and if men in armor forgot it, that was because armor made men believe they were immune to tide and tricks. The rain made the stone steps slick, but the moss that would have been a hazard in a calmer season had washed clean, and the little white crustaceans that live in secret green pools winked their pinprick eyes and kept to their minutes. 2 smugglers with faces like old rope guided the first of the gray cloaks under the lip of rock, and the sound of the sea there was like a god muttering to himself behind his hand. They went one by one, then in twos, Then, with the greed of men who have felt away work and want to be done with fear, the girl went ninth, a number that men who love gods will tell you is neither lucky nor unlucky but simply stubborn. Her hands, reddened by onion water and/or blisters and rope oil, found stone and held it. She placed her feet where she had been told and nowhere else. When the bad rung came, she knew it not from sight but from the way the air changed. The breath of the sea turned a fraction warmer, so she took her weight into her belly for 3 steps and then pulled like a woman jerking a child back from a well. The Septon came last of the first group. He breathed through his nose and counted the beats of his heart, not from fear but for practice. When he reached the little landing, where the shape of a man could be fitted against the wall and make no shadow distinct from the wall's own gloom, he smiled in the dark, and the dark did not know it had been mocked. In the lower guard tower, the pitch cask waited as if for ritual. It had been left 2 feet from the red rope wheel, closer than a careful man would have left it. The man on the wheel had eyes like a chronicle's clerk. He wiped his hand on his shirt before he scratched his face. He was thinking of supper. The girl came in at a height that put her knife where men fail to think to look for knives. The knife entered at the place between the ribs where onion eaters grow lean. He said 2 words and a third half word, and when he would have said the fourth, his head found the pitch cask's rim and then the floor all at once. The oil on the rope showed a new quality of gleam for a moment, then went dark. Another man took a breath to shout, and gray cloaks filled his mouth, hands, ribs, throat, before the breath could find voice. They moved quickly, and they were very gentle with the noise of him. Above, the wheel's whisper did not change. The sea has its own dullards, and men assume that when they hear the sea they have heard all sounds. The guards in the next chamber were playing a sort of bones game without bones. They moved stones back and forth on a board and made a show of not caring. 2 finished. The loser muttered a curse that named no gods because he preferred not to be on speaking terms with them. Then he saw the first gray cloak and thought of a stormbound monk, and the thought amused him right up until his ears stopped knowing what his body was doing. Varys. This was the name the Septon had been born away from and kept in a pocket somewhere behind his heart. Stood in the doorway and watched as the habit of quiet tore a hole in the habit of duty. He was not moved to joy by efficiency in killing. He felt a small, competent interest, the way a cook feels toward a knife that has just kept its edge on a stubborn turnip. He had seen men slaughtered in 100 modes. He had learned how to call for another tablecloth after any one of them. When the stare up into the deep belly of Storm's End was theirs, he set a hand to the stone and felt it old. Old like the stone in certain mornings in certain men's lives. Hollow with the echo of having done what it was made to do too often. He remembered the tale of a boy named Davos bringing onion and salt up a different set of stairs, and somewhere inside he nodded to that ghost. The world was a place where men remembered small kindnesses that kept them alive and forgot larger cruelties that made those kindnesses necessary. The courtyard felt like a well, but a well with bad water. The rain fell into it, and the walls hemmed it round, and all it did was make mud and sullen puddles that reflected torchlight and nothing else. The men who had the third watch were arguing about whether dogs should sleep in the barracks or out. Their voices went up and down, but not warningly. The gray cloaks passed, and ripped time discreetly, and time bled only a little. By the time the first horn's note would have risen at a change of watch, Varys had his 2 men at the winch of the main gate. They had tools that might have been for carpentry or might have been for iteration of an old sin. They engaged the teeth of the thing and worried them, and the thing yielded as things will when you show them that you have all night. The portcullis took a breath, as if startled to find itself alive again, and then another breath, and then 2 more. On the road, out beyond the reach of the castle's torches, the second group was waiting, their gray cloaks now darker than the night itself. Griff stood at their head because his body refused to be anywhere else. The boy stood at his side because he had been told not to and had disobeyed in a fashion so deft and polite that only the noblest of nursemaids would have thought to cuff him for it. He wore his hood low, and the rain ran off it in a trickle that struck the road like a quill tapping a page. "Wait!" Griff breathed, and the boy waited. The rain breathed too. The men behind them shifted their feet with the patience of men who have learned that their feet complain not because they are wronged but because they work. When the portcullis rose, a sound like a throat clearing politely in a noisy room. The boy would have moved, but Griff's hand was on his shoulder, and his shoulder stayed. The first to go were 4 men on all fours, the points of their elbows wrapped in leather, their hands bare, their faces as expressionless as a refusal to play dice with a stranger. They went in like cats drawn by a tidbit. They did not come back. That was good. The men who dislike going back are the men you want most. The gatehouse was theirs before the first alarm cried out. A fellow on the parapet had his head turned at the wrong moment. The world took advantage of his mistake. Another tried to make his little mongrel bark to rouse the yard. The dog, sated on fat, merely watched with the mild curiosity of one who has learned that men often spoil good nights with their nonsense. There was fighting. Fighting always happens because men are not knots that untie themselves. A cudgel connected with a skull in a sound like the bottom of a barrel being struck. An arrow went through a wrist and pinned it briefly to a post. A man dropped a halberd and tried to pick it up with the hand that had been merely scraped, and his fingers would not remember how to close. There was screaming. Even quiet warriors have voices that want to be used when iron touches them. The castellan, Ser Harbert, his name would be later when names were again a custom, came out in linen with a breastplate thrown over it wrong. His hair was wet from washing, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had been coaxing wine into going down a throat that would rather have had broth. He bellowed for courage and for keys in the same breath, which is something like asking your mother and your wife to kiss you at once and for the same reason. His men hesitated because the human body recognizes ridiculousness even when the human will is reluctant to name it. He died because he made a grand gesture toward a banner that had not yet been unfurled, and the gesture suggested to a practical archer that now was the time. They took the inner ward with less trouble than the tales would warrant. Tales like difficulty. They are suspicious when things that ought to be hard decline the invitation. But the honest difficulties came next. Men had to be disarmed and not shamed, because shamed men turn. Doors had to be secured with promises and not with nails, because nails provoke hammers. The kitchens had to be told to cook for strangers without making those strangers seem like masters, though they would be. The maester had to be found and very politely dissuaded from releasing ravens to birds who were, at that moment, sleeping innocently and did not deserve to be wakened to carry bad news into a worse night. Varys went to the rookery himself. He moved as if he belonged there, and when he reached for the keys at the maester's belt, the maester surrendered them as one does to a steward who has attended one for years. The maester's chain caught the light with a small flash, and Varys read it with an old reflex. Iron for war, lead for secrets, silver for healing, yellow gold for sums. The man would be dangerous given a pen and a guest who underestimated him. Maester, Varys murmured, very gentle. Septon, the maester replied, equally so, and then with a spark, or are you? I have never known a Septon walk as if his feet were not touching the ground. I have a light soul, Varys said. Better than a light purse in this weather. Better than a heavy conscience in any, the maester said, and his hands splayed empty to show that he was no threat to anything larger than a ledger. You like your ravens, Varys observed. I like doing my duty, the maester said. We choose our pleasures as we can. You will have letters to write, Varys said. Soon. I will have letters to burn, the maester replied. Sooner. The kind that men have had me keep only because they were not yet brave enough to end them. Wisdom, Varys said, and turned the key in the rookery door. The ravens muttered like old men folding themselves awkwardly on stools. They blinked their bead-black eyes at a plump man in a sodden robe and saw only another permutation of the endless human fuss. They fluffed, resettled, and slept again. Below, in the great hall, men were coming to terms with being alive. Alive was a condition men negotiate whether they know they are doing it or not. Some did it by cursing, some by boasting too early, some by sitting down and discovering that their legs had not been their friends for the last hour. A kitchen boy stood on tiptoe to set trenchers along a board and, in his haste, set one slightly askew so that it would always wobble until the world's end. The girl with the blue-threaded knife sat on a bench near the hearth and did not warm her hands. She was counting the men who would be trouble now that nothing obvious was left to be done. And then the boy, he who had been the subject of so many plans that one could imagine plans sprouting like weeds under his boots, entered the hall with his hood thrown back. The light caught his hair and found the glints there, took them for its own, and lent them back to him such that his face was briefly older and then young again. He had wiped rain from his mouth, and that gave him an expression of having said something important to the storm. Men turned without knowing why they turned. Men turned because there are shapes that hearts recognize, angles of jaw, the set of an eye, a tilt of the head that has nothing to do with learning and everything to do with myth. He had a sword at his side and had not drawn it because the men who want to be followed do not suggest that following them will require a blade in the first 5 breaths. He moved to the middle of the hall and did not mount the dais. He did not need the height. "You have kept this place," he said. His voice was low but did not strain. It was the voice of a boy who had been made to read aloud in bad light. "You have kept it through siege and hunger and shame and confusion. I have not been here for any of that. I have been learning how to stand on decks without falling and how to slip a belt through a buckle in the dark and how to say thank you to a man whose language is not mine. I have been told stories about this room. I have been told stories about the Onion Knight and the king who did not have enough to hold and made more with will. I do not ask you to hand me a thing you have held so hard. I ask to hold it with you." He stopped, and in that heartbeat of silence the rain made itself a presence in the arches, as if it were listening too. He could feel their skepticism and their plucked string hope and their arrogance and their humility, all humming the same discordant chord. He let them hum. He did not rush to tune them. "I was told to wait outside," he said, and the laugh that ran through the room was the laugh men like because it does not humiliate them. "I disobeyed. I will only be worth following if I obey by choosing what to obey." "Who are you?" shouted someone in the back, the someone every room is allotted in its ration of someone's. The boy looked toward the voice and did not seek it. "I am a claim that has learned to walk," he said simply. "I am a name that did not drown when the world tried to throw it into the sea. I am the boy they did not kill in the sack. I am the blood that sits ill upon a usurper's chair. If I have to prove it, I will spend a life proving it. But I would rather spend my life doing something else." "Words," muttered a man near the salt barrel. "Words and rain." Varys watched the boy take that and make a meal of it rather than choke. "Find your proof in your hands," the boy said. "Find it in your bellies. Find it in how long your children have been hungry. Find it in the way the reach feeds itself first while you sit with a wall that fed your grandsires and not one song is sung for you in King's Landing that was not paid for 2 pennies too dear. Find it in your wish for a man who will owe you because you took a risk, and not a man who will turn from you because you were late to cheer his triumph." "Would you owe us?" someone else asked, less adversarial, as if testing the water with a toe. "I cannot afford not to," the boy said, and the honesty struck more forcefully than a parade of false vows. "I will owe you when it goes well and also when it goes ill. My name is Aegon. I will not hide it behind any color of hair." He raised his hands and undid the thong that had been binding the dyed locks at his neck. The hair fell in a dark, wet rope, and when he shook it out, the glints were not glints anymore. They were a sheen. They were the memory of ash that had chosen to turn to metal. In the firelight, in the rainlight, in the breathlight of men who had been surprised into listening. A ghost boy of a line not so long dead as the world had trained itself to think looked back at them from under hair that says dragon. "Test him," said a voice that had not been meant to be heard. It belonged to a man thinking aloud his own caution. "Test him with the old phrases. Ask me what the old phrases matter," Aegon said. "Ask me whether I know the names of the ships Aegon the Conqueror burned or the castles he kept. Ask me if I can tell you the number of bastards a certain king fathered or the roads he did not mend. Ask me the weight of a child I have not yet had. Then ask yourself what weight knowledge has if it is not used to carry something." A small, unexpected noise from the kitchens. Someone had dropped a ladle and then caught it. Varys saw the woman with arms like bread out of the corner of his eye and saw that she had stopped breathing. He did not turn his head. He did not want to interrupt her. Griff came then to stand a step behind Aegon and to the right. He had blood on his sleeve and had not thought to wipe it. The men in the room saw that and saw that he would never have thought to wipe it at a time like this, and they adjusted themselves a fraction toward this boy with the dragon hair. "We will need bread," Aegon said. "We will need grain brought up from the villages before the next storm gnaws the roads to bone. We will need the men who can be spared from the fields to wear gray cloaks and then other colors. We will need ravens to fly not to King's Landing but to Nightsong and Rainhouse and Stonehelm and Fellwood. We will need a path open to Dorne for a talk the world has not yet heard. We will not take women or children for this need. We will not burn barns. We will not boil dogs. We will take this place and then keep it because we deserve it and because we have held it like men." "You talk like a man who was taught by a woman," said a deep, sardonic voice near the door. Varys recognized the sound before he located the man. Black Balak, the Myrish archer whose arrows had a reputation for finding seams in plate and seams in honor too. He lowered his hood and shook his hair back, and somewhere in the hall a woman made the small involuntary sound women make when a legend they have heard in bed is suddenly standing near the bread. "I was taught by many kinds of people," Aegon said, taking the challenge as a gift. "I will be taught by many more." Black Balak's mouth showed 3 teeth more gold than white when he smiled. "We will see," he said, and leaned his shoulder to the post like a man who had just found an afternoon as interesting as an afternoon can be. Varys stepped back into the shadows beneath the gallery and breathed out through his nose. The room's hum had changed. It had not gone to harmony. He had not expected it to, but it had shed one dissonance that had been threatening to trip all the rest. He watched the Maester sidle near with a sheaf of papers clutched to his chest and an expression of false humility that hid his calculation as poorly as a weeping boy hides his tears. "Your Grace," the Maester said, too quickly, testing the taste of it. "If we are to make a show of what has been done here, if we are to let the Stormlands know without letting the throne know too soon, we must choose our ravens with care. Choose the ones that fly to men who think ink is treason," Aegon said. "A subtlety," the Maester replied, pleased to have something that smelled of his craft to do. "May I have leave to?" "You have leave to do what you would have done, but faster," Aegon said. "And you will show your letters to this man before you send them." He pointed, and Varys let the point fall upon him like a cloak. The Maester's throat worked in a swallow. He had recognized that gentle plumpness for what it was, and now he had been made to acknowledge it. The hall took a quiet breath. It is always interesting to watch a man who writes letters be told where to send them. The rain eased in the second hour after midnight. It did not stop. It changed. It became a steady thing, as if the god of storms had remembered that he must not exhaust himself on a single fit of rage but should husband his anger for later. The smell of wet wool thickened. Somewhere in the stables a horse kicked once at its stall, and then rested its head against a post like a drunk forgiving a table. Men slept in armor and will never admit how much it hurts to wake that way. Varys did not sleep. He walked. He walked the way he always walked when a plan was no longer an object he could hold in his hands but a fabric that he must wear until it either warmed him or burned him. He visited the kitchens and counted loaves by touch and by weight because cooks lie without knowing they lie, and their lies are measured in ounces and bellies. He watched the guards at the newly friendly gates and looked at their fingers rather than their eyes. Fingers betray the chance of flight. He told the girl with the blue-threaded knife to sit and eat, and then sent her to sleep in the high place under the gallery where the sound of men's breathing would teach her something she would not know she had learned until the day it saved her. He went to the rookery again and wrote 3 letters and sealed none. He wrote them with different hands because everyone who would open them would see a different kind of author in his mind. He read them aloud under his breath in 3 voices and tore them in half and gave the halves to different ravens when the time came. He took a pair of shears and trimmed a feather on one bird because the bird was proud and he did not want it to try to show off by flying in a straight line. He told himself not to be sentimental. Near dawn the sea was a living pewter bowl, and the clouds were lids parted just enough to show the underside of the god's thumb. A horn sounded from the outer wall in 3 notes that had been taught to Storm's End when Storm's End was young. Varys went to the parapet and leaned his belly against cold stone and looked out and saw a line of riders coming up the road at a trot that wanted to be a gallop but didn't dare because the road was hurt. They bore no banners, which is a banner of its own. They will pretend to be from King's Landing until they are close enough to be from anywhere, said Griff, coming to stand at his side. And we will pretend not to have taken this place until they are close enough to be offended that we have, Varys said. Which of us was born to be a mummer? Griff asked, and he was not mocking. He wanted to know which art in which man's hand was the sturdier. We were all born to it, Varys said softly, but some of us were beaten out of the habit sooner. The riders were 20. At their head was a man whose rings said wealth and whose beard said pride married to ignorance. His eyes went to the archers on the wall and tried to turn them into nothing. He reined up under the gate and called hoarsely that he had impaneling writs from the hand of the king for the Castellan of Storm's End to present himself and answer for rumors and derelictions. He said this in a voice that had been trained to fill rooms and so did not know how to make itself smaller to fit a frightened yard. The gate did not open. The archers did not knock arrows. They observed. The man under the gate swelled himself with their silence like a man who has misread a woman's silence and thinks it means something it never means. He called again, louder and more certain, and spittle shone on his lip. Aegon walked out onto the gatehouse platform. He was bareheaded and his hair had not been combed like a lord's for the morning. He leaned on the parapet the way a boy at sea leans on a rail to watch dolphins and forgets the ship. The riders' horses pricked their ears. Horses are honest. They think hair is grass and men are weather. You have writs, Aegon called down pleasantly. I have a gate. We are both blessed with things that are ours. Who speaks? The man below demanded, and the demand betrayed him, because a true man of the king would have said who goes there, and a shrewder man would have asked who holds the gate. I am Aegon, the boy said, and even the rain did not dare to interrupt. Son of Rhaegar, heir to the throne, host of Storm's End as a guest. A long moment of the kind that prove there is such a thing as a false god because men believe in it while it exists. The man below's horse shifted, affronted by the chill down its back he had not been warned of. The man's mouth opened and closed and opened. You are mad, he said finally, the way men act when they have run out of other words. This is treason in its most ridiculous shape. Come down and put your head in a sack, and you may yet see the inside of a cell instead of the bottom of a... There are rooms here, Aegon said. We will put up your men. They are wet and hungry and will be less inclined to argue with you when they have eaten. You are welcome to dine at my table and tell me why I should give you my head in a sack when your master has never once spent a night in this castle without forcing the kitchens to feed his pride before his garrison. The man made a sound that wanted to be a laugh and ended as a cough. You talk like a... what do they call them? A mummer's prince. I will be whatever kind of prince makes men follow me better, Aegon said. If you are here to fight, fight. But if you are here to speak for King Tommen, then speak as if the boy could officiate anything but his own bedtime. This is insolence, the man hissed, wanting to give the hiss substance by shaping it like law. This is weather, Aegon said, and there was nothing left for the man to say to that did not confess a desire to be dry and fed. He pulled on his reins and cursed the mud as if the mud had mistreated him personally. He led his men away down the road at a pace intended to suggest contempt. Their horses were grateful for any pace that was not standing still under a cold stone gaze. Varys turned away from the parapet with a thought he did not let his face show. Men who bear writs and ring their titles like bells might be the first to come. The second would be quieter. The second would creep in the hedgerows and lie behind a gorse bush with a bowstring under a finger and wait for a face to appear at a window. He would have the shape of a man who does not believe in anything but a wage and the small domestic satisfactions bought with it. He would be dangerous because he would not ask questions of himself before he acted. They would need to let him accomplish something small so that he would believe he had been unobserved. Then they would take him before he had time to make a second, worse plan. By afternoon, Storm's End began to feel as if it had always been theirs. That is the trick of castles. They train men to forget their beginnings. The kitchens put out kettles the size of hogsheads, and someone remembered the old onion story and cut 3 sacks into the stew until the smell made men mistake it for warmth. Women moved through the hall with baskets on hips, their hips making coin of bread. The old oaken table under the window that looked to the sea had a scratch at the corner that no man could ever remember not being there. Aegon stood by it with his hands pressed flat to the wood as if to feel the story of that scratch under his palm. Griff came and set a parchment before him. Nightsong will send us 50 men if we send them 60 casks of barley now, before their own is threshed, he said. Crow's Nest offers us men who know the gorges better than hares if we promise their lord's younger son a place near your council. Felwood keeps counsel and sends a letter that reads as if a cautious man had dictated it while a braver man held a knife at his back. Rain House has burned a beacon 3 times and then let it go dark. And Tarth? Aegon asked. Silent, Griff said. Ser Selmy is overseas where your aunt is, and his brother is a small man for a big island. He will read the wind until the wind has an opinion. Aegon smiled crookedly as men do when the joke is on them and they are not sure whether to admire its audacity or resent it. And Dorne. Dorne is a cat on a fence at dusk, Griff said. Its tail tells you it is dissatisfied with its own uncertainty. And the Iron Throne? The Iron Throne is busy counting small numbers as if they were large numbers, Griff said. The queen that was queen and is now in a cell sets the demon of rumor to work on herself and would rather die of pride than live on bread. The boy king is king the way a candle is a tourney. The hand will send us polite disdain if he believes we are only the weather. Aegon's hands tightened on the table. He looked east for a heartbeat, though he could not see east from that window. And she, still across the world counting dragons, Griff said. Aegon's mouth turned contemplative. We will have to speak to her, he said. Not yet, Varys said, and he did not need to step forward for his voice to enter the conversation. It knew how to walk on its own. Not while our voice is still breaking. When you speak to a woman with dragons, better to do it with a city behind you than with only a wall. Aegon nodded, and his gaze went to the hearth where the girl sat eating the way hard hands eat, testing the bread with her teeth as if it might defend itself. What is your name? He asked at last. Lana, she said, and the lie was good enough to last for months. From no place that matters to anyone but me. Lana, Aegon repeated, as if he were putting the sound away somewhere useful. You pulled a man from a well today. I pushed him first, she said. Then I pulled him back. If you don't do the first, the second looks silly. The laughter was gentle. Griff's mouth almost smiled. Varys filed the girl away under the category of people who will not be where they are assigned when the third thing happens, and smiled to think it because that category was most of the human race. The first raven went to Nightsong, and the second to Dondarrion men who remembered a lightning bolt's charge like a prayer even if the man who had led them had become a tale. The third to Stonehelm. The fourth to a certain man in Dorne who collected secrets with the patience of a spider who has learned that flies are arrogant. Varys wrote that letter in a hand he had seen on a letter from a cousin of a cousin in Old Town, because sometimes it is well to have a letter look as if it has taken a wrong turn. Night came with a wind that had tired itself out. The great hall grew quiet as men took themselves to corners and made their bundles into pillows. A few stayed up to play at dice with stones or to sing songs in voices that were embarrassed to be caught being earnest. The girl named Lana slept with her knife under her pallet. The maester wrote until his eyes watered and then took up an iron link on his chain and held it in his mouth for the taste of seriousness. Varys went up onto the wall. Storm's End's wall is not like other walls. It has about it the simplicity of men who have decided to live to old age regardless of the world's intentions. He laid his hand on it and felt the old strength. He looked out at the sea and did not see anything but black. He thought of a child with a bell around his ankle, limping because he had learned that pity is a coin that buys many things. He thought of a boy dragged out from under a bed in a city that was being sacked by men who would later pretend they had done it politely. He thought of a woman who had once been queen of a place that did not have queens and of her throat making a shape that could have been a laugh or a sob. He thought of a girl across the world with a fire that was not the fire men believed it was. He thought of how to tell her later, in a way that would neither beg nor command, that there was a boy in the Stormlands who had taken a wall and was learning the weight of bread. He thought of elephants and smiled because he is, in the privacy of himself, a man who likes jokes kept for too long and told at the last possible moment. Footsteps came soft. Griff put his elbows on the parapet beside him and looked out without seeing. "You mean to put him on a chair made of knives?" he said, very mild. "Would you sit upon it yourself if the world asked?" "If the world asked," Varys replied, "I would ask what the world wanted to spend. And if it said you, I would arrange for it to forget the question." Griff made a sound that was almost affectionate in its exasperation. "You are not a brave man." "I know brave men," Varys said. "I hire them. I bury them. I am fond of their songs. And I like living." "You like winning," Griff said. Varys thought about it and then nodded. "That too. Does he?" "We will teach him to like choosing," Varys said. "Winning is a happy accident sometimes of choosing well. The rest is accidents of other men's choosing." Below, in the yard, a candle moved and then another. Men bearing lanterns went toward the gate, not in alarm but because guarding is a rhythm, and the next beat had come. A fishmonger's wife, trapped by the rain within the castle, went to the postern and relieved herself with a long sigh that seemed to ease the world. Far off, a dog barked once, uncertain, and then settled into sleep with its nose on its paws and a bit of fat in its dream. Dawn came blunt, without drama, the way a man comes back to himself after a fever and realizes that being well is not an event but a state. The clouds went from iron to lead to tin. The sea had the look of pewter backed by wool. Men began to move again because they had promised one another they would. The first cart rolled in from the village under a stack of barley sacks, and the man who drove it had tied a ribbon that might once have been read to his whip as if to pretend to a holiday. In the great hall, Aegon ate porridge and talked with the maester and a man from Nightsong whose beard was like brush. He signed his name upon a paper and laughed quietly when the ink blotted and said, "I will not pretend my hand is prettier than it is." The man from Nightsong liked that, as if liking it were a surprise. Varys watched the hand as he signed, and what he watched was not the fingers but the wrist, the place where a man's hand tells you whether it will learn a sword grip that does not bruise him. He was not displeased. He was still less pleased with the speed with which the boy looked up when the girl called Lana shifted in the doorway, and the way his face changed to listen to her. Kings must notice every footfall and also no particular footfall at all. He filed it away. News comes the way weather comes, in waves and with breaks in which men imagine there will be no more weather. Mid-morning brought a rider with a broken nose and the wind's temper in his jacket. His horse was foam-flecked. He put his hands on his thighs when he stood before the long table because his legs were not sure they knew how to stand alone. "From Tarth," he managed. Aegon looked at him in a way that both consoled and compelled. "Drink," he said, and the man drank, and the cup trembled so badly he spilled half of it and then laughed at himself and loved Aegon for not minding. "They are watching." The man got out. "They will not send a raven that says yes until they have laid out places at a table for a no. They will wait for the reach to lift its gaze from its own reflection. But they sent me. There is a woman on the island who says the world has a habit of righting itself when no one is looking. She says to tell you that." Aegon bowed his head a fraction, as if to a god he was willing to believe in for an hour or two. "Tell her I am willing to be no one if it will help." The man laughed at that. "She says it will. She hasn't said at what cost." "There is always a cost," Varys murmured, not to spoil the moment, only to keep his own accounts straight. The afternoon brought men from Rain House who had done a complicated thing with their loyalties and arrived sheepish about it, like husbands who have come back from honeymoon before the week is out because they realized they liked being married but not traveling. Evening brought food, and the realization that the first day in a place always feels like 7 and leaves men the tired that sits under the skin and does not announce itself until a man drops a trencher and starts to cry for no reason. Men slept on benches. A boy dreamed of water without ships on it. Varys did not sleep much. He sat at the foot of a stair with his back against a pillar and wrote a list of small necessities that make larger things more likely. Wax, 3 more sacks of oats, a certain pot mender from the town whose work is suspiciously silent, a ladder that was always 1 rung shorter than the wall it was meant to reach, a midwife who could keep her counsel, a baker who could cut loaves to look larger than they were without cheating anyone of a bite. He wrote a separate list of men who would be dangerous if left idle and matched them to tasks that would make them believe they were indispensable. On the second morning, the first properly crowned storm of the week rolled in from the sea with the self-respect of a king returning from his own coronation. The wind came like an armed man. Rain sheeted so hard it stung the skin through cloak and shirt. The sea gate was a throat-swallowing glass. The cove where the ships lay hidden roared to betray them, and yet did not, because sound breaks itself into fragments in such places. It is hard to hear even what one wants to hear. The Golden Company hunkered and cursed the sea gods in each other's tongues and told lies about elephants so extravagant that for a moment each man pictured one standing patient on the shingle, tail flicking at flies that were only rain. It was that day a knife came for Aegon in a loaf of bread. The loaf had been baked too perfectly. Men with honest hunger make imperfect loaves because their hands cannot resist. The slit was almost nothing, a breath. The crumb just that shade denser where the blade lay. A boy would have cut it and been rewarded with blood for his curiosity. The girl named Lana saw it first and set her thumb on the bread and felt the hum that tells a person there is some wrongness in an object that has nothing to do with the object itself. She did not shout. She did not throw the loaf on the fire and make a morality play. She cut the bread with a calm hand and let the knife twitch and then sit on the table like a snake in winter. Varys was there before anyone thought to call him. He looked at the knife. He looked at the bread. He looked at the girl. He said, "Thank you," and the thank you had weight like a coin large enough to lean on. "It is nothing," she said. "It is something you learned by not being taught," he replied. "Those are the lessons that stick." Aegon looked at the knife with a face he had practiced for this moment. It was not stiff with outrage. It was not loose with bravado. It was intent. He put his hand on the table beside the blade, fingers spread. Griff lifted the knife and showed the room its length and then set it in his belt, as if to say that a knife is a poor enemy once seen. The baker was found, and the baker had a wife, and she had 3 children, and there is a fashion among captains for making points with other men's children that Varys despises. He managed it another way. He had the baker's wife set to kneading while she wept, and he sat and wept with her, and by the time 2 bowls of dough had risen and been punched down again, the woman was telling him more than she had known she knew. The knife had come from a cousin who had a debt, who had a friend in the king's pay, who had a hatred for men, who had decided they had waited long enough to be poor. They did not hang the baker. They sent him back to his oven and made him feed a visiting party of men from Stonehelm. And the men praised his bread, and the baker cried because he had remembered how to make it imperfect. The cousin's friend with the king's debt found himself in a ditch with a broken leg that had happened by accident. These things communicate themselves through villages like warmth, and men begin to decide their own loyalties in ways that remain, in the official account, inexplicable. On the 3rd day, a raven that had been fed half a piece of pear and petted by the maester's wrinkled hand in secret because men must have softness or they become something else brought a note with a ribbon of martell orange. It did not say yes, it did not say no, it said, "The desert is a place where men have learned to wait for water without spending themselves on mirages." Aegon read it and smiled as one must at an ant's letter. He sent back, "I am a place where rain does not make rivers yet because the riverbed has only just been cut." It was good as such messages go. It invited things. It did not require them. On the 4th morning, the rain took pity and went off to beat some other country. Light fell into the yard not because the sun had found its brightness, but because the clouds had mislaid their obstinacy. Men stood with their faces lifted like flowers that had not thought themselves flowers. The sea looked battered and proud of it. Aegon climbed the wall and stood looking east again, though still there was nothing to see there. Griff came and did not tell him that looking at nothing exhausts men faster than pushing against something. Varys joined them. He had slept an hour, and in that hour he had dreamed of a chair again, but this time it had not been knives. It had been a chair in a kitchen, and a woman had set a loaf of bread on a board and cut it into slices with a knife whose honest edge was sharper than any regicide's. She had made a sound of satisfaction and said, "Sit." He had sat. He woke resentful at being woken from bread like that. "She delays," Aegon said. And he did not say Daenerys because men who set themselves on a path and say the names of the other paths too often lose all the paths at once. She gathers, Varys corrected softly. She has a city she must love long enough that leaving it will feel like fidelity rather than betrayal. She has dragons, and dragons have the hearts of cats and the appetites of horses. She must learn to lead hunger by the halter. Better to meet her when you can be a harbor rather than a fellow swimmer flailing toward shore. I will not kneel to her, Aegon said, and there was the brittle of boy in the words, but also the iron of a man not wishing to break later. You may not need to, Varys said. Men kneel to weather and believe themselves brave for enduring it. A horn sounded from the lower road. It was not the three-note call for guests. It was a stranger's call, improvised, the kind that can be a prelude to either comedy or blood. Men moved briskly toward the gate. Men always move briskly toward beginnings and endings. A company in green and gold and crabbed white came up the road from the villages, flags limp in the newborn breeze. They were not Tyrell's men. They wore no roses, but they had the scent of the Reach about them, the exhaustion of having been sent by men who consider their decisions more important than other men's meals. Their captain asked to parley, and did it with the grace of men who have dined on grace all their lives. In the gatehouse's shadow, Aegon stood with Griff to one side and Varys to the other, and the captain tilted his head the fraction that on a tourney field would be called courtesy and in a dockside brawl would be called insult. Storm's End is a seat in fief to the crown, he began, and Varys took, with inward amusement, the way these men begin with law when fear might do, and with fear when law would do. Storm's End is a place, Aegon said, and places are themselves before they are any other man's. If you want to sit in it, you will have to come up these stairs. If you want to leave with your men's hands whole, you will have to take bread. The captain's eye flicked to the parapet, counting. Varys watched him count the wrong things, the glitter of helms rather than the steadiness of the archer's breath, and smiled with only his left eye. The parley was a dance that men do when they mean to buy time to fetch more men, and Varys let it last long enough to be plausible without letting it become tedious, which is when men make mistakes to entertain themselves. When it ended, the captain had accepted bread with a poisoned look as if to inoculate himself against generosity, and Aegon had accepted his compliments with a boy's impatience hidden under a prince's poise, and the walls had accepted that they were being asked to be patient a little longer. Varys stood behind Aegon and thought of ropes and ladders and the way the wind would favor an attacker or a defender on the morrow. The morrow did not bring a siege. It brought a trick. It is always so. Men are too fond of telling one another that there will be a great heroic struggle and then are surprised to find that the god of tactics is a jester. The Reach men sent 6 men disguised as masons bringing stone because storms had chewed at a corner of the outer tower for a century's worth of years. They had the tools for building and for dismantling. It is a small business to adapt either to the other. Varys had a man at the gate who had never seen masons carrying stones wrapped in cloth because stones do not catch cold. He let them in because he wanted to see how they work. On the stair, the first of the men unwrapped his stone, and the second unslung a short spear, and the third had already discovered that ladders are good even inside walls. 6 men died, and the man who had wanted to see how they work saw. He was the first to take a spearhead under the collarbone. The girl named Lana took an axe from a barrel, and with it she cut the ladder's legs, and the men on it yelped like dogs hitting the end of a chain. The archers on the parapet were told that this was bread and not war, and they cut the loaves into slices at a distance. The men in green and crabbed white did not get to the second landing. When it was done, Varys went down into the stair and found the one man who had decided, in the moment of attack, to discard his spear and sit down on the steps and cry for his mother. He had him set to carrying water from the well for the next 3 days and told no one why. Men must be allowed to earn back their faces. In the evening, Aegon called for the men he had and set them in a room with a map scratched upon a table with a knife and anchored with stones taken from the yard. He set his finger upon Weeping Town and then upon Mistwood and then upon Rain House, and then he tapped his finger upon the sea and held it there until the men around him had learned a lesson they would perhaps be ashamed to have named if it had been framed in words, that the sea is not a wall nor a road but a mind, and must be treated as such. He said, "I will go to Night Song," and Griff said, You will not." And they looked at one another as men do when both have decided to be right. Varys let the room's heat rise to where it might boil and then took it off the flame with a word. "You will stay and be seen," he said to Aegon, and he used the tone men who have given orders with swords dream of using when the sword is not in their hand. To be seen is to claim. To leave is to invite someone to claim for you. He turned to Griff. "You will go and be invisible, which you do nearly as well." Griff's mouth went tight and then relaxed. Aegon's went tight and did not. Varys set a hand upon the table close enough to Aegon's that the boy could have covered it with his own and didn't. "Would you like to begin with the lesson where you believe I am wrong?" he asked without heat. "We all love that lesson. It's the one that teaches us how to listen later." Aegon laughed once, and the laugh undid the hard line of his mouth with one tug. "Begin with 'We will need more bread,' and I will obey." "We will need more bread," Varys said gravely, and the room's shoulders lowered a fraction into something like relief. That night the sea made a new sort of sound against Storm's End's base. Not the battering of a desperate lover, not the gossip of a retreating friend. Something thoughtful. Varys stood under the gallery and let the sound climb his spine and settle behind his eyes. He thought of Dorne and of the long terrace where a woman with bones like a cat and a brain like a ledger sought to balance an old account. He thought of King's Landing and the silences that clung to it now like a smell left behind in a stable that has been swept. He thought of dragons across the world that were, at that moment, sleeping with their heads under their wings like geese, and of a girl who sat looking at their slow bellies with a mixture of love and accounting that would make many men hate her if they saw it. He thought of ravens and knives and onions and rope. He thought of a chair that had been made as if to show that ruling is a thing that hurts. He did not smile. He did not pray. He set his palms together as if washing, a habit he had acquired when he learned to exchange one person for another the way a man exchanges coats. He sat, he rose, he slept for an hour. He woke and walked through the castle that was now the measure of a boy's claim. Storm's End breathed like a great animal asleep in a time between hunts. Outside, rain returned, not in fury, but as if to remind every man that the world has its own intentions and we are allowed only to pretend to direct them. At dawn, a boy from the villages, eyes pale with lack of food and too much wind, came into the great hall cradling a thing as if it were a bird he had captured that would die if he raised his voice. It was a carved length of driftwood, the shape of a ship's figurehead reduced to the simplest curves by hands that did not have time for art and yet made art anyway. On it, a dragon was suggested by a sweep of line, a boy by another. He stood and held it and would not give it to anyone but the one whose name he had been told. When Aegon took it and smiled and put his hand on the boy's hair, the boy remembered every kindness he had ever experienced and decided to live 3 more days. Little things make larger things truer. Varys collected them the way a child collects shells and lays them on a shelf. He collected the way the maester bowed lower each time he left the hall, not because he feared but because he had decided to commit to the fiction. He collected the way the girl named Lana began to give orders to men twice her size and they followed as if she had grown ahead in the night. He collected the way Griff relaxed only when he was outside the castle, and the way he stiffened as if his spine were a true iron rod when he stepped back within. He wrote again by night to a prince of Dorne and to a lady of the same house whose anger has a shape you can only see at noon when a certain palm tree makes a certain shadow. He wrote to Tarth, a letter as blunt as the rock itself. "You will not be made to regret your patience," it said. He wrote to a lord in the Reach who collected songs and had never fought a duel but had arranged many. "I offer you a story worth owning," it said. He wrote to King's Landing not at all. The days made themselves into a braid. Rain, parley, a skirmish, barley counting, a letter. Rain, a ship with salt rash bringing men whose accents wrapped themselves around swords. A quarrel over whether men who fought under dragons must dye their cloaks black. A woman from the town whose husband had fallen from a ladder and whose pay had to be found from somewhere, because men who are given bread are quicker to tell you where the best quay rats live. Aegon learned to say no as if it were a kindness and yes as if it were a risk. Griff learned to sleep in a chair without letting his face forget itself. The maester learned to love the taste of tin in his mouth because he held his chain's link there when he needed courage. The girl learned to throw an axe so that it hit flat when flat was better than edge. On the 7th day, when the storm broke truly and light fell on Storm's End like confession, Varys stood with Aegon on the wall, and the sea was silver hammered by a giant smith. Far to the east, clouds sat on the horizon not like lids but like a promise. "She will come," Aegon said, and this time he let the name be in his tone, if not in his mouth. "She will come," Varys agreed. "Do not ask whether she will kneel. Ask whether she will walk beside. Do not tell her what you have done here. Show her. And please, do not take offense when she tests your bread before she eats it." "Is she like you?" Aegon asked, surprising him. "No," Varys said. "She is like herself. That is a rarer thing than people think, and more dangerous." They stood together in the wind and said nothing more. Below, in the yard, the girl named Lana was showing a boy from the villages how to hold a bow without making enemies of his own shoulders. In the kitchens, a cook told the baker that his loaves were almost as imperfect as they needed to be. In the maester's cell, a raven preened one feather and decided not to bite the man's finger because the man had a way with the back of its head. Storm's End kept its shape. The world shifted a fraction. Men made lists. A chair that was not there seemed nearer by a day. And the sea, which tells truths when it must and lies when it can, kept any news of dragons to itself and laughed softly in its sleep.